Everyone. My name is I'm going to be doing today. And some of these are already theories that have been integrated with some of the current research, and some are still a little bit out there. But I'm sure they will open some new ideas with a lot, because these are things that everybody deals with all the time. And I have a few new ideas about them that I'm happy to share with everyone today. Okay, as we get started, you can see the title wasn't exactly clear. I'm going to be focusing on the Herodian Cultural Revolution. And what I mean by Cultural Revolution, we'll understand a little bit more clearly later on, but alongside the well-known and well-documented stories of the political and the building projects that Herod did in his life, we know Ehud Netzer, who I was very fortunate to be in to study with and close with before he tragically passed away. The Ehud Netzer and his school really did focus on Herod, his building activities, his building of Judea as an amazing center of the Roman East, which it became during his time period, and so on. And all that stuff is the background to what I'd like to do today. Some of the things were published in a book that was dedicated to Ehud Netzer. In this volume, I have a short article which has some of these ideas, and the rest of them are either in my master's thesis, which is here. Let's see if you can see it with a silly background. But anybody that would like, it's on my academia page, and they can look at it there. Let's get started. The first thing I want to do before I get into the new ideas is clarify something that I think many of us, especially tour guides, not necessarily get wrong, but lose the proportion. Because when we say the Second Temple period, we usually don't mean the Second Temple period. The Second Temple period, if you begin not necessarily at 539 with the Cyrus Declaration and the First Return, with Zerubbabel and Yehoshua and so on. If you begin with 516, the building of the Beit HaMikdash, the second year of Darius, it lasted until 70. That's a huge amount of time. If I'll ask you what events took place between 516 and 333, the arrival of Alexander the Great, you'll have very little to share. Ezra, Nehemiah, and a few other scattered things. But if we say Second Temple period, we're usually referring to one of two things. We're either referring to the time period from the beginning of the Hasmoneans, the Chashmonaim, or the time of Herod the Great until the destruction, from around 37 BC until 70 Common Era. Which means that we're talking about, if you compare it proportionally to the Second Temple period, it's a relatively small amount of time. But what I would like to show you in the next few minutes is the impact that the very last chapter, namely the Herodian period and what came right after, left an impact way beyond anything that came before. And it's very specifically during that time, but it's a little bit clouded in what we call Second Temple period, but we don't realize that many of the institutions that we assume existed during the entire Second Temple period actually only were developed, came onto the scene, or in the form that we have during the time of Herod, and continued afterwards in what we call Rabbinic Judaism. So that's just as an introduction. Now, one more thing. We talk about Herod. Don't be confused with coins. Herod the Great begins his counting with 40 when he was appointed king. We'll get to that in a moment. Of course, there's so much to read about Herod, but when we speak about him, we're going to attribute some of the responsibility for this cultural revolution to things that he did directly, But I think if we look carefully at the global picture of what's going on in the Jewish world, in Judea and beyond, it isn't only the things that he does directly, but it's the things that he initiates, the cultural changes that he initiates, spur changes that he had no either interest in or real involvement with, but nonetheless, they're part of this general cultural evolution, which I'd like to try to illustrate shortly. Now, what I would like to claim before we get started, before we get started with what's happening, we have to review just a few points about Herod's biography, because that is going to be important when these things are happening. And we can more or less separate Herod's kingdom into three. We can, the first third of his kingdom, let's say from the beginning, 37 until, or 40, depending which way you want to count, until around the year 3129. Okay, I say 3129, a very two important dates that I will relate to shortly. That's the first stage of his kingdom. The second, which would be, let's say, the core time period from around the year 29, 25, up until a few years before, let's say, around 11 or 9, when then we already see signs that he's not necessarily going crazy, as Aryeh Kasher would have liked to claim, but that his paranoia and the threats against him make him do things that put him off the charts in terms of normalcy, killing his own children and going after it, thinking everybody's against him. I often say that when you talk about Herod, paranoia is the fear that everyone is like this irrational fear that everyone's out to get you. It's not really paranoia when people really do want to kill you. That's just being careful. But the last third of Herod's kingdom, he more or less was less active. He was staying inside and things like that. So what happens though in the change of when we move from the first to the second third of his kingdom are some dramatic changes in his life that are going to be very important in terms of his influences, both political and cultural. And that begins with initially when he becomes king, being that his pedigree is not the Hasmonean, he's not a priest, he can't worship in the temple, as the kings had done for the last century and for as much as the people around him, meaning we know what the rabbis tell us today, that the Hasmoneans didn't deserve to be both the priests and the kings, but at that time, that was their claim to the legitimacy of their power. So he marries Miriam, and in many ways wants to use the Hasmonean kingdom as the support for his legitimacy as a king. And you can see that also with his building projects when he builds the palaces in Jericho on top of the Hasmonean palaces, in many ways saying, I am the outgrowth of these original, the kings, and marrying into the family and so on gives him that type of legitimacy. We all should be, familiar with the story that his nephew, his brother-in-law, Aristobulus the third, was when he was killed in the pool, and his eventual murdering of Miriam herself when he realizes two things. Number one, his relationship with the Hasmoneans and his attempt to use them as giving him any additional legitimacy, either one, isn't working, or two, wasn't worth it, because he was going to have another source of power. Where was that going to come from? Initially, he comes to power in the year 37, when we have the Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, are competing for the helm of the Roman Empire, and later Augustus. And Augustus and Mark Antony are going to have their famous showdown in the War of Actium in the year 31. For if you're interested, there are many written about it, but Herod was very close with Mark Antony. He supported Mark Antony. If it wasn't for a skirmish that he was taking care of with Nabateans at the time, his army probably would have sailed out and be fighting on the side of Mark Antony in Actium in 31. And so when he gets word that in the Battle of Actium, Mark Antony tragically lost, he could have done what Mark did himself. Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra, they basically committed suicide, because when you're on the losing side in something so dramatic, you have very little chance. But Herod did something very daring. And Herod got on his boat and he sailed to Rhodes, where he knew that Octavius's army, his fleet was encamped, and he walks right into requests to meet with Octavius, later Augustus, and from now on we'll call him Augustus. And he says, everyone knows how friendly I was with Mark Antony. It is no secret. And I mourn him as I mourn a brother. But from now on, as you are the victorious one, I offer the same friendship that I offered him, I offer to you. And Augustus accepts this. And from this time on, Herod and Augustus are now bound in this friendship. Augustus probably had his own reasons for agreeing. Again, Herod was at this point a source of stability for the East. Mark Antony didn't have, there was no any other, he could have thought about maybe putting back a Hasmonean that would be loyal to him, but there weren't too many alternatives at this point. And it just would seem to be, for a number of reasons, not beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about now, the good choice. And this is going to be critical, because the second that Herod is now now from this point on, when Herod is dependent on Augustus, it's not just a dependency of of a superpower to the client king, but it's much more than that. It goes beyond that, way beyond that, to the point of deification, meaning Herod is going to now build right away temples dedicated to Augustus, showing his tribute to the new emperor, to the new emperor of the Roman Empire. And he's going to do, in many ways, he has to show his loyalty. And the demonstration of loyalty that Herod is going to show is not only in order to, be the, proper client king, but he's got to go the extra mile, because he's got to show Augustus in that he's already gotten rid of all of the emotions that he had for Antonius, his rival. And when Augustus goes in to Rome and takes over Rome, he is also going to make major changes, social and eventually cultural changes. And so at the same time that Herod is going into the second phase of his kingdom, okay, from the initial phases where he was building and thinking about it wasn't really clear of his direction, he will now parallel in many ways Augustus in some of the things that are happening. Now, what is happening in Rome? If you're interested, you can read this very good book by Andrew Wallace Hadrill, who spent many years in Rome. He's currently, I think, at Cambridge, and he outlines what goes on in Rome. And in just brief, broad strokes, what he shows us is that alongside the building up of Rome in a marble city. I found this city in concrete and I left it in marble. He makes major political changes. He basically gets rid of all the old guard and he replaces it with a new set of a social class, a new upper class. In addition to this, and alongside it, he initiates a whole new scheme of art and architecture, which in many ways reflect these new ideas and ideals of this cultural revolution, things that Zenker had pointed out previously, but Wallace Hadrill put it together. And what I would like to claim is that Herod, both intentionally, but also both naturally, because coincidentally, that when these things were happening in Rome, and Augustus Herod was doing as much as he can to mimic Augustus, to glorify and establish his loyalty. Establish loyalty means, in many cases, he will hire workmen from Augustus's new schools of architecture and art to build his palaces in all the famous places that we don't need to go through now. But it's clear where these things are going to be implemented. What we think, oh, these things are obviously Roman. No, some of these things are going to be new things that appear only at this time. Some of them even disappear relatively soon afterwards, so it's quite fascinating that they appear in Jerusalem at that time. Now, alongside, this is just some of the examples of the Herodian buildings, one just final example of this, and this is its own story of how much Herod is, in many ways, his attempts, again, the temple, which you remind in Caesarea, is to Rome and to Augustus. The temple in Shomron that I had here was to, I don't have the picture here, but was to Augustus. The temple in Banyas either was done by, it was also probably to Rome and Augustus. When we look at Herodian and look for types of influences for there, this was Hadrian, this was Augustus's, what he built for himself as a mausoleum, and you can see that it could be that the circular tower type of idea could be one of the influences of Herod's building of there. That's its own story, and it's very important for the background, but now we're going to shift back to Judea and try to focus on some of the things that are going on here. Josephus describes that when, unrelated to the events we had before, the description of Josephus is not one like specific piece. It's collected from about 7 or 8 different places in both works, both in Jewish Wars and in Antiquities. But they describe something like this, and that upon getting rid of the Hasmonean base for his kingdom, he was left with quite a problem. He had an issue. What was his issue? His issue was very simple. The Hasmoneans had been the high priests. The Hasmoneans had controlled not just the temple, but they had been basically the core of the entire upper class of Jerusalem. We read that Herod kills 45 high priests, and we understand that the background of that is basically purging anyone that he sees as a threat to his kingdom, anyone that would either be a support of returning or reinstituting an Hasmonean king, and there were a few alternatives at the time, or anyone that would be any other type of. Now, I'm assuming there were 1 or 2 priests that were related to the Hasmoneans or involved with them and said, "Oh, we're either they ran off to Alexandria, as we know some did, or they said, no, we're with you. We've now changed our allegiance," and that can be understood of how that would have happened. But Herod it seems had another, the other place where we can see this happening is when he appoints a high priest. And according to Josephus, the sources Josephus writes from, of course, Josephus is at the destruction, and we'll talk about the sources of Josephus and the relationship with Herod in a moment. It says he appointed a man named Hananel, or Hanamel, to be high priest, and in most editions he was a Babylonian. And so when we ask ourselves, where would Herod find priests that one would be loyal to him, who weak enough that wouldn't be a threat to his power, that he's not going to assume the high priesthood himself, because obviously he can't take that, but he imports high priests from the Jewish diaspora. If I say Gola, I might get in trouble now, but the Jewish diaspora that from Hanamel, there is one text that actually says that he was from Alexandria, but we're going to see that could be, and this is something we're going to see happening a little bit at the beginning, throughout this part of Herod's rule. Because what it seems happens, that is not just the high priest that has arrived from Babylon, he could have been there slightly before. It's unclear exactly whether he brings him in from Babylon or he's already in Jerusalem, but he has, his family is from Babylon, so he's less threatening to Herod. But during this time period, we're talking about now the years 29 to 20 to 15, that 15-year period seems to be a period of mass orchestrated aliyah, meaning Herod is the first Jewish agency. He actively recruits wealthy Jews from the Jewish diaspora to come live in Jerusalem and be part of his new upper class. Because in order to maintain a functioning city in the Roman Empire, you need an upper class, both mercantile and commercial reasons. You need those people around. And if many of them were now purged because they were all killed off by the Hasmoneans, they need to be replaced. In addition, we know that some of Mark Antony's non-Jewish court runs away. And where do they go for refuge? They go to Herod's court. Not just the famous Nicolaus of Damascus, who formerly was the historian and scribe for Mark Antony, now joins. That's the context in which he's now joining Herod, and will now document everything Herod does from this point onward. But there are others. There's another. There's a few other functionaries within Herod's court that formerly were part of Mark Antony's court. So these things are all happening at the same time. Herod probably at this point begins building a neighborhood for them. We're familiar with that neighborhood. It's called the Herodian Quarter. Those houses were built, he basically flattened an entire area in the upper city of Jerusalem and built up beautiful palaces, probably to house these people, these families. We know later the Ben Katros family, also probably one of these families that, or a descendants of them, of these families that were initially from the Jewish diaspora. And here we start asking where. So I mentioned Babylon, probably also from Rome itself, maybe from, because we know there are now many, the ships are going straight in Caesarea and Rome and bringing in merchandise and workers, and there's movement of people. A Jewish family can easily get on one of those boats and come to Jerusalem. But all of the movement of those towns, I think, are dwarfed by one other very important Jewish city, and that is Alexandria. Because what I'd like to claim is that the main city of this, the main influence at this time is going to be Alexandria, and that will demonstrate in a moment. One more point I'd like to say about Herod personally before we get to talk about the cultural influences of his time is that Herod himself, I'm not, again, he's depicted for us in many ways as like this crazy lunatic ruler. He was not. Okay, most of the things that he did, except for a few things that were kind of crazy towards the very end, in the last third of his kingdom, were done very much according to the model of what a client king in the Roman Empire was expected to do. A very successful one. If you compare it to others like Juba of things that he did are even, seem to be quite reasonable. Even killing your own children, that was the best way to ensure that your will and testament is going to be fulfilled. If you actually kill the other potential heirs, then you know that which way your inheritance is going to get to. So all those things fit within that context. But one thing I think that we can maybe, again, this is what we don't know for certain, is that Herod did want to build up support amongst the Jewish masses. And even when he builds his theater in Jerusalem, he wants people to appreciate the Roman culture and things like that. Where do we see hints of this? And I'll give you a few examples, although these are not the only ones. When we found in Masada these juglets that were imported from Rome or from Italy, they had in them residue, not necessarily these bottles, but things similar to them, of garum. And if you're not familiar with garum is like the ketchup of the Roman Empire. It's like an anchovy paste. It's made out of fish, of bones and stuff. This is preparation of garum today that's ground into this fine paste. To us, it would probably be something absolutely putrid. I don't think we would go anywhere near garum. But what scholars tell us is that garum is made of hundreds of types of fish. And if you, the garum though, they were able to, because they had the residue of the garum in the dish, the imported garum brought to Herod, and we know it's Herod because it has the inscriptions of Herod on it. They found, and the article is right here, and I'm more than happy to, if it comes up here, I can share it. If you don't see that, I think I have to share this as well. What they're able to show, the garum they found at Masada had only species of kosher fish. Now, in order to do that, meaning they would use hundreds of types of fish, put it all together and cook it all up and whatever they did with it. But if they would have found only kosher fish, it meant there was a special order. And unless you were somebody of Herod's stature, it wouldn't be something feasible to order your own garum that would be only kosher. Maybe some people would permit it because of, it's eno machal achilat kelev. But this is, but one of the claims that's made is that Herod not just ordered his own garum, like he ordered his own wine or he ordered his own grape apple jelly or something that he has there, but that he had it ordered kosher. Recently, we have found that there have been claims about the numbers of mikvaot. Somebody has written about it recently. The numbers of mikvaot, of ritual baths that were found in Herod's palaces demonstrate. I mean, again, we don't know how much he was religiously, it wasn't an internal thing. It was about demonstrating publicly that he followed the rights of the Jews and he was the king of the Jews. And as king of the Jews, he would perform these things as he was supposed to do so, whether it's publicly eating kosher. We have a quote from a famous Roman writer that it says it was better to be the swine in Herod's courtyard, meaning a pig, than to be a son, because the pigs he didn't kill, but his sons he did. And this is something that's known in Rome, that he would keep kosher and that he followed the Jewish law. So in terms of him and his public appearance, that's a very important part of what he's doing. So just understand that as part of it, something sort of lost a little bit. But all those things are now, I'm going to put those aside because that's about Herod himself. But what is going alongside the things that are happening in Herod, his court, the upper class in Jerusalem, there's another change that's happening. within local material culture. And I want to be able to explain that. Material culture is everything that archaeologists find. Meaning, when we go into these houses, that again, when we find them, we're looking at the destruction in the year 70. So I can have to assume that it's only 70, but how much of it can I now say it goes back to the initial foundations of these houses in the year, in the time of Herod, which let's say around the year 15 BC, 10 BC or so on, maybe even 20, some of the earlier houses. And what we see are a few things here. First of all, if you notice these two jugs here that they put back here, we don't know exactly what they're called then. The Mishnah mentions a large stone vessel that's called a kalal. And so archaeologists have given these tentatively the name a kalal. And I will get to the kalal. I guess I'll skip to the kalal now. Where are they? So you can see in these pictures where Avigad, this is from Avigad's book, there, the kalal, a stone tool which only appears in Jerusalem from this time onwards. You can see these are two classic examples of these that were found in the Herodian quarter. And you can see this illustration that was found, which has the same thing, but there's slightly different shapes. And what I would try to claim, there's some similarity with the calyx crater, for this type of crater, which is like a huge, it's like a punch bowl, okay, becomes very popular during the time of Augustus. And it's one of the features of this new material culture art form that we find in Rome, meaning the Greeks had already done it years before. We can see one here in the red on black. But this type, made out of marble and sometimes made out of bronze, become very popular in Rome during this time period. What are they used for? They're used primarily, not exclusively, primarily to decant wine. We know that wine in the time of the Second Temple period was not drunk straight, but you diluted it with water. So you take the large, narrow jug and pour it into this crater, and then maybe you would use one of these small little jugs to pull out the wine. And to make a very, one of the things, what I wrote down in the article, is that we now assume, one of the assumptions, and one of the things that's almost common knowledge now, is the theory that the stone tools appear during the time of Herod, particularly the ones that are made out of chalk in the Jerusalem area that we know were all hewn out of chalk, are there because now there is a renewed enthusiasm for the following of the prohibitions of the Jewish purity laws. Partsat Tahara Yisrael. Okay, that is documented and it's a possibility. What I would like to claim is that the appearance of the stone tools and the impetus to initiate this new material culture was not necessarily or not exclusively the purity laws. Okay, the purity laws. First of all, these things are very expensive to make. Some of the smaller tools, not necessarily. Their usefulness as being able to be reused because they're made out of stone isn't always worth it, because if you just take a cheap ceramic bowl, those were almost used like we use disposable dishes today within the world of eating tahara. But that aside, they're not very useful. The types of shapes we found were not useful. They're mostly serving dishes. And they're the exact types that we find used in Rome in marble. Now, there's no marble in Jerusalem. So you could import a huge stone thing, or you can go to the closest, to Chizmeh, go into a cave and have one cut out. Now, why would it be in this shape and not the shape of a calyx crater? Because of the way that you're cutting it out of the rocks, it just makes it more sense to do it in this way. So what I would like to claim, this is what I did claim in the article, is that the stone tools, and right now we're going to include also the story of the ossuaries, which appear at the same time, I'm going to say something about that in a moment, and are part of the same stone industry, aren't appearing for any type of change in theology or the ideas of what's going on with the dead and so on, although there might be a slight reason that might exist, but they're part of something else. They're part of this new community. Now, what I would like to explain is like this, and particularly the ossuaries. Now, ossuaries are known already for about over a century. We found them in some of the earliest excavations that were found in Jerusalem. The first proper excavation, the King's Tomb, they found a number, King's Tomb, which belonged to a first century tomb of Shlom Tzion and so on. There were dozens of ossuaries that were found there, Gluskemaot. But we weren't able to determine exactly when they began. And so if you look at Levi Yitzchak Rahmani's very seminary work, which he puts out basically the first proper classifications and a proper catalog of the ossuaries that were known up to his time. By the way, his theory is they belong to the Prushim. And that was what they jumped onto the stage when the Prushim became popular. Why? Because the Prushim had new ideas of an afterlife, which the Tsukim didn't have. And if you have an idea of an afterlife, or more specifically, the need for preserving the bones because you believe in physical Tchiyat HaMetim, if that's going to happen, then it's going to there. So then it's going to be associated with that. So that theory has been critiqued by many. But most specifically, when Rachel Chachlili excavated in Yericho and finally published her results from the excavations in the cemeteries in Yericho, she finds that the ossuaries do not appear from the Hasmonean periods, and they don't appear from the first part of Herod's rule. It's only from the middle of Herod's rule and onwards. So this goes back to the first point that I was trying to make. We say, what did burial look like in the Second Temple period? And we always use an example of the ossuary. And what I would like to claim, and most, again, people are still not clear on this in some of the writings, is that ossuaries do not appear in Jerusalem, and they're a Jerusalem style. It appears in Jerusalem, and from here it spreads only at the time of Herod. And where do they come from? So you'll notice there are about 10 different theories about where exactly they came from. Some say they came from the east in Babylon. Some say they came from a local tradition that evolved from the former burial practices. But if we look a little bit closer, and this was already suggested earlier, these ossuaries might have found their origins in Rome, particularly in Rome. In Rome, where cremation was the primary method of burial, there was internation of human body, but of the whole body, but it was mostly the millions of people in Rome were mostly cremated if they were lucky enough to be buried. And many of the urns look like this. But there's a whole world of urns that became very popular also in the Herodian period that look like this. These are funerary urns. They're for the bones and the ashes of the bodies. This is one. And you'd put them in these niches of these underground catacombs from the Augustan period. And so what I've claimed, and again, I wasn't the first one to have this idea. This was suggested by many. It conveniently was also the idea of my advisor, Israel Levine. And the idea here is that these the Gluskemaot that were in Rome, they were again in marble, are being now produced in Jerusalem to be a Roman form. Now, what I would like to illustrate is the following. We have a new upper class arriving in Jerusalem. It is a mosaic of different peoples that are coming in from Rome, from Alexandria, from Babylon, from other parts of the country. What we can say that is characteristic of the majority of them is they're relatively wealthy. They have a connection with Herod, and this is what's so clear, is that they're very proud Jews, which means that their culture they want to call Jewish culture, or more specifically Jerusalemite culture. But they don't have any common method of burial, of eating, of dining, and stuff like that. And so where do they look for their influence? Where do they look to be their cultural lighthouse? Rome, specifically Augustan Rome, in the new phase of Augustan Rome. And so they take the Roman method of burial and adopt it to the burial that fits with their lifestyle, which of course is just the bones. It's the likitat atzamot, which is similar to what was done beforehand. And then they adopt it, which also will explain to us something else. If you look at how the caves were designed and how the ossuaries, it's very awkward. The caves were designed for either a body or a coffin to be placed within a niche, within a burial niche, which, by the way, also might have originated in Alexandria. But regardless of that, when the ossuaries came in, they just put 2 or 3 in one. They put them on the floor. There wasn't a clear way of doing it, because here we had the merging of 2 separate or converging of 2 separate styles of burial that were now coming together. And the idea again here is that when this new Jewish community in Jerusalem began to mix the different traditions they had brought with them, this started to create a new type of culture. This is the cultural revolution that's happening in the shadow of the new Herodian buildings. And it's going to impact what we're going to call Rabbinic Judaism for many years onwards. And with that, I will now just give you a few other things to think about where I think are also connected to this same thing. Now, let's start with a few, I guess we'll start with the biggest cultural, I went the wrong direction, the biggest cultural institution, which is the synagogue. And I'll try to explain how I see how this fits within this picture. You see, if we go back to, where does the Second Temple period synagogue begin? Where does it start? Where's the earliest synagogue? So if you look at the current literature, particularly that of my advisor, Lee Levine, who claims that the synagogue is an outgrowth of the institution that in the biblical times took place within the city gates. And when the gated city, the walled city disappeared, it took a few years, but that institution, a secular institution, which included public gatherings and so on, moved into this new building called the synagogue. Okay, there's only one little problem with that, which Professor Levine does acknowledge, but doesn't really answer, is that we have a gap, a way too big of a gap from leaving the tell and leaving the walled city to having our first examples in the archaeological record. Now, you can't prove anything from things not existing, but we do not have any examples of synagogues in the area around Jerusalem or around there from the Persian period, from the early Hellenistic period, and so on. When do they begin to appear? So I'm not going to go through every single one. That could be a topic for another lecture, is to go through each and every one of the discovered Second Temple period synagogues. Let's just say what we were taught, most of us were taught in the courses, is completely wrong, because Masada and Herodian are not classic Second Temple synagogues. They were built to the very last phase and aren't part of a town and don't reflect necessarily what's going on in all of Judea. But we'll set even those aside. In the last 20 years, even since Levine published his seminal work, we've found numerous synagogues from the Second Temple period. The most recent in Magdala, that Second Temple. I'm not saying that had now the one that have here. If you're not familiar, that's Modi'in Elit, Beit Kiryat Sefer. There is also this one is Magdala. There's one found in Beit Shemesh. They're just recently in the press that they want to destroy it in the new construction, and Gamla. But what I tried to show in my research is that every single example, except for, and somebody I see in the chat notes that, the archaeologists at El-Udan and Modi'in that claim the initial stage is Hasmonean, but are all post or either contemporaneous with Herod or post-Herod. And that includes Gamla, meaning Gamla was very difficult. The excavations are very, romanticized, whatever, but they were very poorly done. And they were recently redone, reassessed. Let's just say it's not clear that there was a real synagogue there before the time of Herod, but that is still not. It still doesn't discount what I'm about to say, because what I'd like to say is following. Because parallel to all that's going on in the land of Israel, we have a Jewish diaspora, Golah, Futsa, I don't want to insult anybody, but let's just say from about the year 100, about the year 50 BC, the majority of the Jewish world is no longer living in Judea. The majority of the Jewish population is living in the diaspora cities, in Alexandria, Cyrene, all along the Mediterranean coast, in Rome, in Antioch. We're familiar with them. When Paul is going to go visit them a little, when he goes spreads the words of Christianity, but he's going to synagogues and well-established Jewish communities. So we know they exist there. But you can see here, this is the Delos synagogue from the first temple. That's one of the earliest archaeologically dated synagogues. But if we go even before then, the earliest structures that seem to be Jewish public ritual buildings, very specific, come from Egypt. I don't have the things here. I have a whole separate slideshow that I can show about it, but it would have been too much to bring them all here. We have about 7 or 8 inscriptions, and we have another few examples from literature relating to the synagogues. Now, synagogues from Egypt, or prayer halls in Egypt. In Egypt, it's possible they were actually called prosuche, which means a place of prayer, as opposed to synagoga, which means community. And what we can establish there is, and they go back to the 3rd and maybe even the 4th century BC. And what we can understand from all this is the following, is that in Judea, or particularly Jerusalem, and anything before the Herodian period is really just the outskirts of Jerusalem. There wasn't really another area that can be spoken about. The temple is the place of worship, both for prayer and for communication with God. And you don't need a synagogue. There's nothing else to do in a synagogue. What I'd like to claim is that all of organized prayer and the reading of the Torah and all those things, as much as the rabbis would like to, claim that they go back to the times of yesteryear, there are things that developed as we know them only during the time of Herod, which means that what we can establish is the following, that in Judea, there's there are no synagogues, there's no need for a synagogue, and there would have been a priestly reaction to synagogues as competition for the temple, and they wouldn't have been well. And therefore, even if, what I would like to say is that even if Gamla was from the early, there were buildings like synagogues before Herod. It didn't begin with Herod. There were institutions that existed and developed in the Jewish diaspora for centuries, but they didn't become institutions or central institutions in Judea because they were overshadowed by the temple, and the priests in the temple wouldn't have want any type of competition. What's going to change in the time of Herod? Now, again, one more thing about Gamla. Gamla is far enough away that it's already in the orbit of Antioch and Tyre and Sidon Jewish communities, and therefore influenced by them, who already probably have their own synagogues. So it's not necessarily, I don't even consider that technically part of the culture of Judea, of Jerusalem at that time, meaning the pre-Herodian period. So even if right now the archaeology is unclear, but I would like to claim that it does look it's not clear there was a large public building there from before the time of Herod. What we see there is from the destruction in 70, or particularly 68, whatever it was. But I would like to claim that there wasn't a proper synagogue. Now, there may have been, Umel does claim there was a building there, a structure there, Hellenistic, but they can't prove that the earliest building was a synagogue. And what I would like to say, that even if you find one example of a synagogue, it's possible that people had heard about a synagogue and wanted to build one. But it's one in one tiny town in the when you have thousands of towns around, or hundreds of towns with no synagogue, because the method of prayer and the method of worship is going up to Jerusalem. Now, Ehud Netzer, and I did have an opportunity to speak to him about this once, he claimed there was a synagogue built within one of the palaces in Jericho, and he claims that's the oldest synagogue. Now, again, it's not. It was not part of the Ma'amadot were done in. Ma'amadot were done in the plaza of the town. It was done in the largest open area in town. They were not done in the synagogue. And what we see in the Mishnah is depicting the last phase, which is from the time of Herod to the destruction, when basically overnight we have synagogues popping up everywhere. And that's where I'm about to claim, is that once Herod comes to power, and this large influx of diaspora Jews with their synagogue institution in their suitcases, or in their cultural suitcases, they arrive in Jerusalem and they want to build up a synagogue to remind themselves of the synagogue that they left in their original community. This should remind us of something, because this is the inscription that we're all familiar with, the only real archaeological evidence of a synagogue in Jerusalem, and it is not surprising to me that it is associated with the diaspora community, both that it's written in Greek and that it mentions the name that Fetanos, which Ruth Gerson associated with one of the senatorial family, possibly a Jewish family that was a slave family in Rome that was given their freedom, maybe the freedmen synagogue mentioned in the New Testament. And you should also look at the New Testament, because when the New Testament speaks about synagogues in Jerusalem, especially in the book of Acts, every single one is associated with the diaspora Jews that don't speak the same languages, and so on. Why would the Kohanim? They did it. They probably did object. The probably Kohanim did object the spouting up of synagogues, but when the synagogues, but Herod, they at that point they didn't have enough power to do anything about it, so they sort of joined in with the fun and found a priest place in the synagogues as well. What I would like to this is also part of a theory. There are definitely lots of theory here. I'm not claiming there isn't, because what I'm missing now, and I'll explain to you, I am missing the book before Philo. Because now this is already, from here on, is like another chapter, and this I've not yet published what I have is 2 unfinished articles that that I have prepared, and what I'm missing is the work before Philo, because Philo theoretically should be able to show me what Judaism in Alexandria looks like. Because what I'm going to try to claim is that in Jerusalem was a place of cultural conformity, stagnation. It was a place that the priests are very conservative, with a lowercase c, meaning priests priestly rights try to follow it, and their power comes from everything being done the way the things have been done beforehand. So where did new ideas start from? I would like to claim that new ideas started in Alexandria. When Alexandria was first founded in the 4th century, okay, they needed population. You needed people to live in Alexandria. And so they imported populations. There were populations that were imported locally, and some from Rome, and Jews were imported. Almost a third of the city at one point was Jewish. This whole area, even in all the maps, is called the Jewish quarter. The whole eastern part of the city is the Jewish quarter of Alexandria. And so the Jews arrive in Alexandria, and they have to start living a Jewish life. They don't assimilate with their neighbors, which is something very, you can give their credit, and become a vibrant Jewish community that we know were tragically killed in the Pumul Shalkitos around the year 117. But until then, what did their Jewish community look like? So what I'm saying is that we theoretically could get a good picture from Philo, and I think we do in terms of the language and some of the things there. But Philo had already come into contact with what we're going to call the rabbis. And some of what we later identify as rabbinic traditions, he's already sort of cross-pollinated with them. So I don't have a pure sense of what Alexandria was like. And I'll give you a few examples. I believe that in Alexandria, this is, again, you can take it or leave it. These are just theories, but they're based on the way that things have developed later on in Eretz Yisrael. That if there's a synagogue, a prosuche, there's a building they're worshiping in, you need to do something. So you have early prayers. What did their early prayers in these Hellenistic synagogues look like, or prosuche look like? I think one of the main texts that they used to either read, glorify in many different ways was the 10 Commandments. And we can see this does appear in the writings of Philo. And it may have been what was on the early Tefillin and the early Kriyat Shema. The early Tefillin, which we first find in Qumran, but they existed in other places in the Second Temple period, just happens to be that Qumran, we found it was dry and things were left there. Mostly people would take their Tefillin with them. They're micrography, they're tiny, because if you're wearing them all day, you don't need very large ones. But they had the 10 Commandments on them. And so what my claim is that Tefillin developed the way the Second Temple period version of them were developed in Egypt, and the primary text was the 10 Commandments. The same is true with the mezuzah. The mezuzah, which we can see here, the Samaritan version of the mezuzah, is basically the Kriyat Shema, right? What is Kriyat Shema? Kriyat Shema is kind of an odd prayer, but we don't really often pay attention. It says, "V'ayu advarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzaveh etchem hayom al levavecha." So what are the dvarim ha'ele? In our traditional rabbinic and legitimately rabbinic, we say it's either the Shema itself, which is a bit cyclical, or it is Vayuat Varim Ha'ela is all of the Torah or all of the teachings and something like that, which is understandable. But where does the Shema appear? The Shema appears right in the book of Dvarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, right after the 10 Commandments. And so one way to understand it is that it's saying that these 10 commandments should be, and this is the way the Samaritans understood it, these things should be always on your lips and on your doorposts and so on, and on your arms. So this could be another support to it, the Nash Papyrus, which is a papyrus that was found in Egypt from the Second Temple period, which all it has is the 10 Commandments and the Shema. And so I would say this is like the Kiddush Levana card, meaning this is, I don't know exactly what type of either prayer or public reading it was part of, but this would have been like the Kiddush Levana card is like, you don't want to take your whole Siddur or the whole prayer book or the whole Sefer Torah just for this 10 Commandments, so you write up one card which has that on it. And that's the way I understand the Nash Papyrus. I'm not going to elaborate too much more about these things, although I think we can add a few more things to the list. I think Purim was not celebrated the same way in the diaspora and in Eretz Yisrael until the Herodian period. And when this diaspora community came into Jerusalem, they sort of brought in the ways that they were celebrated outside of Judea, and these things were later formulated to what we're familiar with Purim in the time of the Mishnah, and Yavne more specifically. One more thing. Yeah, I mentioned the Theodotus inscription. I didn't say anything about it, but again, that was the community from Rome particularly, and some people say part of the Freedmen's Synagogue, although it doesn't have to do with this thing. Now, I want you to look at this. This is the Jewish neighborhood. This is another map. There's another. There are two other very popular new forms of worship. Not Artemis was popular, but that became very popular in Alexandria and later in all the Roman Empire. Okay, it spread from Alexandria all the Roman Empire. One is the worship of Isis and the worship of Serapis. The worship of Isis and Serapis, Isis and Serapis, I'm reading, this is, the Isis is not related to our Isis of today, is a worship that initially was part of the Egyptian rite, but connected to but later was adopted by the Hellenists and later by the Romans. And one of the articles, again, this is just part of it, that I like to show is how many comparisons there are in what we call rabbinic ritual to the early rites of Isis. Not saying that Jews were looking at forms of worship. They stopped animal sacrifices. So what are you going to do? You're going to pray first thing in the morning. Where does that start? Isis prayer is in the first break of the first sunlight. That's the Vatican. And if you look, you see that's a holy knot. Isis has a holy knot that she wears on her thing. The knots, the tefillin, have this type of holiness. One of the worships that is done to Isis and Serapis is the repetition of the holy names. And Isis has like a whole number of holy names, very similar to the names that we find, the holy names in early rabbinic thought. So and I have about a dozen of these. So it's not just these three editions, but there are dozens of them, and that maybe we'll share at another point. But let's going back to our story, because I think we do see this cultural revolution happening in the time of Herod, and others have documented it. We can also just add one more point, is that we can understand the arrival of Hillel, which is legendary. He came from Babylon. One text said he was actually a Dayan in Alexandria. It'd be very helpful if he was both, but I don't know exactly but historical Hillel where he existed. But we know he definitely came from the diaspora. He arrived in Jerusalem, and as an adult became one of the leading justices. How can that happen? How does a diaspora leader take that position? And this is the cultural context that I would like to I would like to understand this, because when you have the cultural context of a diaspora, the diaspora uh, upper class, which were not necessarily, religious and so on. And we know there's still Prushim and Stukim, they're having it out from the previous time periods. And it's a little bit of this is where one of the places that I'm still a little bit lost is exactly how this new diaspora community sort of joins in with the arguments of the Prushim and the Stukim. I think part of the lack of clarity is because most of our sources are from the end of the process, not from the beginning or during the process. But let's say we have stories in the Talmud that are very much are classic fit, like that suddenly Erev Pesach was on Shabbat and they didn't really know how to do the korban, and Hillel comes up with a solution of how you're going to do it, because no one at the time knew how to do it. There might be a hint there of some type of a change in the calendar. But in that story, I see where Hillel is sort of finding his place, and I see that he's able to have that place. Now, what I'm also claiming is like this, and this is one of my favorite Mishnayot is in Eduyot. It's actually a series of Mishnayot. Eduyot is a tractate that brings down the testimonies that the rabbi sat in front of the court in probably in what we call Yavne, and gave over as many of the things that they could remember from the temple period. And they say here, they have one argument that was from the temple, whether or not you do smicha on Yom Tov, which means that you take your hands and you put them full force on the animal. Is it something, and that is also whether or not women do it as well, whether or not it's a obligatory something, or whether it is just reshut, whether it's just something you can do voluntarily. Now, that entire argument aside, it has one sentence in the bottom there, and it says, until the students of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai there were no other arguments in Israel. Which means, yeah, right, there were no other arguments. They argue about everything. Look at Miksat Maaseh Torah, and you can see a whole list of things that were different between the different sects and the different groups. And there were many, many arguments. But what this means, though, is that from the eyes of the rabbis that edited this Mishnah, everyone outside of that window, okay, are off the charts, are not part of what we're going to call us. So if you were a tzduki, or if you were an isim, or if you were one of the diaspora Jews doing something completely off the radar, then then what we're saying is that then you're not part of Judaism, and only Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are part of it. Now, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are a riddle. How can you have Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, which have very, very different, the laws go down to things like marriage, and it says they weren't, at least one point when they weren't killing each other, they were willing to marry one with the other. And the way I explain the ability to Beit Hillel, which I believe were the new kids on the block, to be able to be accepted, and Beit Shammai also being considered to be legitimate, is the context in which Beit Hillel arrives. In that, Beit Hillel is more or less, and it's not, again, Beit Hillel evolves, so it's not only what Hillel, Beit Hillel is saying, what I'm saying is that Beit Hillel it represents some of the ideas that came in from diaspora Judaism. Beit Shammai is more based on what traditions had existed there before. And this is similar in a way to what had already been suggested by Yisrael ben Shalom. He wasn't well received, but these are some of the ideas that he had. Okay, I know there's lots of speculation here, but what I would like to claim is that during the time of Herod, we have an unbelievable cultural revolution that we have very little sources outside of that talk about rabbinic Judaism that go before the time of Herod. And if it is, it's very, very sketchy exactly what was there on. Shimon ben Shetach and the laws of Ketubah and things that are, but not what we would call rabbinic Judaism per se. And there's no synagogue Judaism in Judea before the time of Herod. But very quickly, because of the diaspora community's influx of coming, the diaspora influx of, not just influx of coming, because when a group of people come and they're part of, let's say, the lower or middle class, they don't necessarily have the same type of influence that they can have when the upper class and the upper middle class. And that's what I'm trying to say. These diaspora Jews, which many of them were familiar with, let's say the families of Nicanor, the families of Simon of Kyrene, all these families that we can see, the families of Ariston of Apamea, that we have both his burial and his mention in the Mishnah. And these are, Menachem Stern put together an entire article with all of the B'nai B'teira, I mean, all of the families, the diaspora families that received, that are in the sources that came into Judea during this time of Herod. And to summarize, so what we're saying now is the following: Herod, especially during the middle part of his time of his reign, was building up the country with all kinds of marble buildings or not marble buildings or whatever he was building. The temple he built up all these other things that eventually mostly were destroyed and just provide us in the good years with lots of beautiful things to show tourists. But alongside of these amazing changes, what also was happening was an unbelievable social revolution in the country, which I think was fueled by I'm going to answer some of these things here. They're fueled by the diaspora Judaism, Jews and Judaism from Rome, from North Africa, from Babylon, but I would like to claim that more specifically from Alexandria, and that during this time these new ideas came in. It took another 150 years or so until the practice to be more or less evened off. What we call Yavne is when the rabbis sort of made decisions what's in, what's out. And then in the Mishnah, it all gets documented, but that's only 200. That's only in the year 200. So it loses some of the novelty of these things that when they were introduced and this time period. So as a conclusion, in a moment, I'll address some of the things that appear in the chat. And if anybody has comments or what I'm like to say is that we call Herod the Great. So he was not a great person, but he was not and even if he built these beautiful buildings, I remember some of the arguments I had at the end of class, like, it sounds like you're glorifying this guy. Now, Netzer, in many ways, he looked up to him as an architect there, but you have to realize the guy was an awful, awful person, personally. But after looking more carefully at Herod, we can say two things. Number one, he was I would say no more cruel or rule than any other standard Roman client king. And that's something we just have to understand, that we're looking at him within the closer context and not in the broader context. But also, I think if we look at what he was trying to do as a king of Judea, his influence is well beyond just leaving behind a lot of holdout buildings. And he left behind a cultural influence, some which were directly related to things that he did, but others were just set into motion by the things that he encouraged and initiated that led to what we call Second Temple Judaism. So I think it could be that some of these things are incorrect, and this is plenty of of theories here, but I think we can all agree that at least for some of the things that we assume are Second Temple Judaism really are much more specifically Second Temple that relate to the very last episode of the Second Temple period from the middle of Herod's reign until the destruction. Okay, that's what I have for now, and I'm more than happy to have a discussion or comments. If
Asher, that was great. Okay, guys, Asher, please go through the chat first, and
okay,
anything that you haven't addressed, please address it.
Okay, I gotta scroll up here. Okay, most of the halals with the kuf. Yes, the this at the end of giving over these ideas, Professor Schwartz, Daniel Schwartz says, so you're saying that basically the entire was basically taken over by diaspora Jews that came into Jerusalem and took over, and we both nodded our heads. Yes, that's what happened. But it's Babylonian Jewry. We really don't know much about Babylonian Jewry. Gafni writes an article where he puts together as many of the sayings of Chazal about it. We see people are called Habavli. We have not just the high priest Hananel or Hanan. Habavli is from Babylon. We know there's a very vibrant Jewish community that's been there since the time of Yechezkel, and that continues afterwards. We don't know really anything firsthand. When Rav, who's the student of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, arrives there, he meets up with Shmuel. And so we have a few characters from before Shmuel, and we have traditions that go back there. But we really, it's a sort of like a mystery of exactly what was in Babylon from during the Second Temple period. There is communication there. There are a few stories in Josephus that talk about things that go on there. Some of them are pretty amazing, like him meeting up with these two Babylonian Jews that had their own private army and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. But there's no real answer of what was going on there. It is possible. This is similar to what Gafni. There's another article about the claims that Babylon was the source of the synagogue. Is that they also had synagogues in Bavel. It's very possible they had a public institution that was used for prayer. I don't know if they called it a synagogue. They probably called it a Beit Kinishta, which is another suggestion of where synagogue comes from. The Beit Kinishta, which means the house of gathering of Knisa, could also be one of the sources there. Hillel would not. I didn't say Hillel came within the context of these caravans of wealthy Jews that were arriving. He was, according to the rabbis, he came as a poor lad that came out with nothing. But he does come in the context of this new aliyah. And there could be why there. But those are legends that appear in rabbinical sources, are not necessarily the best historical sources. So we don't know that much about there. Yes, there were Babylonians in the Golan Choran area. The Bnei, there are lots of other things that were going on there. Bnei Betera and the house of Zamaris. There's all other families that were given there. Herod puts families of diaspora, that puts the diaspora Jews on the border there to give, again, because he expected diaspora Jews to be more loyal to him, as opposed to people that may have loyalties to Hasmoneans. Hillel not being a native to Eretz Yisrael, it says he was, the source again, either he was from Bavel or he was I can share that. I'm sending out now a paper which has all the sources on the there. I'm also, if you go to my academia site, if you're not familiar with academia, you should be. My master's thesis is there, and almost all this stuff is in that. So still unfinished ideas, but I think it does maybe a lot of things to think about. I was stopped a few times because it is a little bit challenging to think about that rabbinic Judaism didn't start the way we were taught, especially for people that are traditional Jews like I am. But I think we really do, if we're going to be intellectually honest, there are a lot of things that come up as a big question. I'll just give one more example just to help understand within Kriyat Torah, which I've done a lot of research on. The public reading of the Torah, in its first form, we find in Eretz Yisrael, like they were reading on the holidays and stuff like that. They may have read in public gatherings on the temple. But we should realize, first of all, that the reading the way we do in the reading the way we do is only from Babylon, meaning the way we do it on 1 year, we do a section and finish it off in 1 year. In Eretz Yisrael, they developed a 3.5-year system. This we should all be familiar with. But when did it start? So there are two traditions that appear. One is in the Bavli, in Baba Kama, Pei Bet, where it says that these things go back to when Moses was traveling in the desert. Now, how do I know this legend's got to be just a legend? Because before the Torah was given. So you kind of can't have public reading of the Torah before you actually have the Torah. And therefore, the idea when the rabbis have in giving these types of, legendary sources is that the Dorshei Rishumot are written down is that it's really early, and believe us that it's authentic. That's more or less what they're trying to say. More specifically, I would like to claim that the reading of the Torah as we know it, as a public form of worship, we can see it happening already at Mesiach Lefi Tumo in the New Testament. Okay, in the New Testament, when Jesus walks into the synagogues, what are they doing? Either reading portions of the Torah or the prophets and having a drasha. That's what's going on in the synagogue. There's no organized prayer. One of the things that I didn't go into now, but is the research of Ezra, Ezra Fleischer, who basically tries to show us and proves that organized prayer, the way we know it, only really begins what we call Yavne. I keep saying what we call Yavne because even if Yavne isn't a physical place that they had an organized session and discussion, it's happening during that time period because all this stuff is organized and ready by the time of the Mishnah, when the Mishnah is codified by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in the beginning of the 3rd century. So going back to the point of Kriyat Torah, I would like to say that in Alexandria, they had a form of Kriyat Torah, and that can be seen in the works of Philo. It was probably in Greek, and it was probably a little bit different than what we know of, and there might have been reciting of the 10 Commandments as part of their prayer. I'll add another little thing that might be connected, that I did a bit more speculative, even off the charts for the stuff that we have here, is in, they found a 3rd, 4th century Christian text, apostolic constitutions, which are these prayers, these Christian prayers that have all kinds of, that are from the Greek, early Greek churches. But inside these Greek Christian prayers are Jewish originals. And what it seems to be is they had a copy of the Siddur from the synagogues of Hellenistic Alexandria. And I can the early form, what we call the Kedusha, is there. An early form of Kaddish is there. And they have a very central place for the 10 Commandments. What happened to the 10 Commandments in rabbinical law is that the claim was that minim, that because of taromet haminim, there's a little bit difference in the Bavli and Yerushalmi, but more or less they tell the same story, that because that the early Christian communities or Judeo-Christian communities put the Ten Commandments too much on a pedestal and were claiming this was the only things that were received from God and everything else was not, we're going to emphasize the Ten Commandments in our prayers. They took it out of the tefillin, they took it out of the mezuzah, and we're left with the Kriyat Shema. That's more or less the way the rabbis depict it. And it could be part of this tension that that could have stemmed from this fact of the early Jewish communities in the diaspora they didn't want to have it too much like the way it was done over there. Maybe that's part of it. I'll add just one more point that I could have added before. This also could be, and there are some that have written about this could be another example or another explanation of the great cultural divide between the upper class and the lower or the middle classes that led to the eventual revolt, or at least what happens during the revolt, that the Jews weren't working together. And another one of the things that were different between the upper class and the lower class is the upper class were mostly either Greek or foreign speaker, Greek-speaking Jews that were wealthy and from original families that came from the Golah, and therefore even more detached from the locals around. So there could be that. This could be part of that explanation as well. Let me go back to the chat to see if I left the chat for a second, and I'll see if there's anything else that anybody else would like to have any other types of. Again, these are ideas that I shared with a lot of different people. Some people say it's a bit too much. It's a bit, but I think that because we focus sometimes so much on. I also, in terms of the public reading, I meant there's another tradition that goes back to Yoshua ben Nun and then one to Ezra. So even if Ezra does something publicly, but if there's no synagogue institution that people are in, then it's very hard to have any type of public reading, unless it's in the temple itself. And it doesn't seem to be there was a temple there. I have a Mishnah in Tamid that I need to explain how Kriyat Shema and is part of it, but I think that Mishnah in Tamid can be explained from after the time of, without too much difficulty, after the time of Herod. That is more or less what I would like to be claimed.
Asher, thank you very, very much. This was really quite new, enlightening, and something that we're all going to be thinking about. Really appreciate your sharing this with us. And thank everybody. Thank you for joining us today. And,
okay.
Join us tomorrow at 11:30. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.